Well, it was a long time ago. So, what I remember really is the camaraderie, that we all realized we were in for a lot of work, but we were happy to do it. And we felt it was a big learning process for ourselves. I mean, when you handle 3 or 4 papers a week and have to read all them and come to conclusions, you really broaden your knowledge. So we all felt that we uh, learned a lot about medicine and how to do research and various techniques, which we would not have gotten without being on this board.
Boy, there are a lot of memories. Let me start with the camaraderie. I mean, the weekly editors' meetings were really a lot of fun. And they started out as sort of a group therapy session. You know, when we broadened the focus of the journal, we upset some authors who were used to getting everything published in the JCI. And we got some angry letters, some really angry letters, which demanded a public apology or requested that our hearts be collectively cut out and shipped to them in a box. So at the beginning, we started the meetings by reading the most angry letter we'd gotten that week aloud. And you know what? It served not only as sort of a group catharsis, but also as a way of keeping track of the impact that some of the decisions we were making had. We also had a great editorial staff, great executive editor and editorial staff. And that was the secret for increasing the turnaround time. You know, in those days, pre-internet, we called reviewers to get them to review, and then we called them to badger them when they were late. And we had some staff perfectly tailored to that job. There was a young Irish woman with a charming lilt in her voice. She was the one who called to solicit the reviews. No one could say no to her. Everybody said, sure, I'll review that paper. But when it was time to get the review back and we didn't have it, we had another guy in the office, actually a charming fellow, really warm heart, but he'd been an ex-Israeli military pilot. And he could be pretty fearsome on the phone. And you know, those reviewers listened and they responded. So as a result, we got fewer excuses for late reviews, but some were really doozies. And they were so good that I actually read them aloud at the annual meeting when I was giving my report. I went to the notes and found a few. I took the manuscript to a meeting in Europe and I couldn't find a typewriter. I lost the manuscript on the New York State Thruway. I lost the manuscript in the men's room. I lost the manuscript in the Pleistocene layer on my desk. And some of the rejections were so funny and piercing that I also read them aloud. For example, this one sentence dagger to the heart read, "This paper shows that what was unlikely to have happened did not."
So the weekly meetings were wonderful because I interact with most of the brightest physician scientists. But my favorite memory is that of introducing the JCI Free Online in the early days of the internet. Prior editors such as Phil Majerus and Bruce Scharschnitz had put away invested funds in a rainy day account. I continued this account and luckily got out of the market just before the great .com crash. This fund now approached enough that I could go to the society, let us release the JCI on the web. That's freely access to everyone. I didn't realize that we'd actually created something which would later many years be called open access. People have forgotten that JCI did it first. But David Lippman, director of the NCBI, noticed, and so I got it in with him.
So yeah, there were a couple of things that sort of stand out. First of all, we really enjoyed coming to these meetings. I remember, I have a very clear memory of we were talking about a really well-known immunologist who had a paper that was being under consideration, and there was a lot of criticism of it from people who knew the field. And one person whose name I won't mention, who was one of our associate editors, got up out of the room, immediately left the room, and said, I don't want to be in on a discussion of that because I think he's going to nominate me to be in the National Academy. And in fact, that's what happened. That guy did get in the National Academy, and he didn't want to be able to say that he criticized his paper. That's one thing. The second thing was, we developed a shorthand, which was, we had the words NFU, not for us. And we would immediately be able to reject out of hand and certain papers NFU. And the third thing I'll just remember, but I have to be a little careful because this is a little bit crude. There was a story that maybe you've already heard this story, but Phil Majerus, who had been at WashU, the editor, and was quite a strong individual. And we heard the story. He told me the story. I visited WashU, and he told me the story that he had handled a paper had been handled, and there had been a split decision. And so he secretly became reviewer 3 and criticized the paper considerably. And so the authors came back with a paper in which they said they could address the concerns of reviewer 1 and reviewer 2, but reviewer 3 was basically an idiot and didn't know what he was talking about. And so he responded, he wrote back to them, F you, basically, in those words. So we used to talk about the Majerus response. That became the Majerus response that we would sometimes want to say in our meetings. We never said that to any author, any of us, but it was sort of a wonderful thing. And we had a lot of camaraderie. We had a big Christmas, we always had a Christmas party or a holiday party together. I think I put together some poems 1 or 2 years to comment about each person. And it was really an enjoyable group. And a lot of us have stayed as friends over the years. So, I mean, it's hard for me to believe that that happened over 30 years ago, but it was a very enjoyable, it was stressful. We worked really hard because you'd get papers every day delivered by somebody. Everything was before the computer at first. There was a computer in the office of JCI, but you didn't communicate with that. You had to do it. It was only for the editor to use in that office. And so, but each of the associate editors, we had an assistant who walked around taking papers that came in every day. And then we'd meet once a week. I mean, I know it sounds very hard to believe, but that was the way it was in 1992, you know?
Since I'm an argumentative sort, this was great fun for me for 5 years and an entire board. And I have to say this, that, you know, most times people say, oh, you must have been so relieved when your tenure was finally up. But I have to tell you, a majority, almost everybody in the board came forward and said, I would do it for another 5 years if I could. Just the discussing science, hearing different perspectives, you know, it's not your own work. You're really looking at something independent and being able to work with other scientists. You know, they always say, what really attracts people to a certain institution or a certain group? You want to surround yourself by people that are smarter than you. And we always felt, this is what it felt like with this group, that we were all learning things that we were unaware of in the past. And to tell you the truth, probably one of the, I was going to tell you before, there was a bad part to all this. And the bad part is for 5 years, I got to do anything I wanted to do. No one could tell me. I used to have huge fights with Jeff Leiden, that was the president. But at the end of the day, you got to call the shots. And the only sad part is I never got this opportunity again for the rest of my academic career. So it spoiled me. But one of the nicest things was the 2 deputy directors, John Lau and David. David is still at Michigan. John Lau left, eventually ended up at Genentech. And Alan Saltiel actually became the head of the institute where John, David, and I all worked. He's now at UC San Diego. We became, during that time, the best of friends. And here it is, 25 years later, we still get together almost every year as a group for biking trips or hiking or visiting. So it's been a lasting sort of relationship. And the only thing I have to thank for that is actually the years at the JCI. I have no regrets whatsoever. It was a wonderful experience, and I feel honored and lucky that we got to be able to do this.
So first, I'm going to say that most importantly was the great interactions with the editorial board, meeting every Tuesday, late afternoon, learning from my colleagues. It was a fantastic 5-year run, created some really good, long-lasting colleague friendships through that experience. And looking back on it, it was an enormous amount of work, but I probably would do it all over again. The biggest impact for me personally was probably my famous Big Lebowski editorial. And when I look back on that, I think that it did serve a purpose by energizing thought around how we can make the NIH more responsive to the needs of the scientific community, which was my goal in writing that.
Well, there were many editorial board meetings that were raucous, so I can't remember a specific one. I do remember the camaraderie. I remember that I really looked forward to our meetings, and I think everyone at Penn, well, it's you can't say everyone, most people really looked forward to it, and people voted with their feet. If they didn't like doing it, they would have left. You know, no one was making them be associate editors or deputy editors. So the camaraderie was great. I formed friendships through that I probably would not have formed otherwise. And Maury Birnbaum is a good example of somebody that actually lives near me in Boston. And my wife and I see his wife and him socially all the time. So I formed a number of friendships. I remember that. I do remember a couple of specific comments that came with reviews. I think the one that I remember best was when some irate author wrote back when a paper had been rejected and said something, and I'm going to quote as well as I can here now, said that if I sent in a paper that I had a dog that talked, you would come back and say, yes, but what's the mechanism? So that was probably my favorite. I do remember a faux pas that I committed that Ushma, you will remember too, no names here, where I accidentally CC'd somebody on an email where I was complaining that I was getting sick and tired of their whining and they should get a life. So I try to read my emails addressees more carefully before I send them out. Those are some of my memories. There's obviously many others. There's a sad memory. One of our editors, who was a friend of mine, Alan Gewertz, passed away of lung cancer during his tenure and while we were still stewards of the JCI. So, you know, life moves on and good and bad things happen, but those are some of them.
There wasn't one moment for me. It was basically the entire 5 years was a moment in history for me that was like none other. We met weekly in person, and you could imagine that if you meet weekly, you really get to know your colleagues. And we developed terrific friendships that have lasted to this date. The respect that we developed for each other, for each other's expertise, for their knowledge, for their way that they would respect authors and authors' views, but yet really try to provide the best review that we could for that manuscript was just unbelievable. I just relied so heavily on the wisdom of all my editors, and it was breathtaking in terms of the depth and knowledge that they brought to the table. It was really spectacular. It's very interesting to be on the other side from the laboratory. We're all in the lab. All the individuals on the editorial board were scientists in their own field. They're terrific and well-accomplished, highly accomplished individuals. To be on the other side was an education for all of us. And it's like everything else, until you really appreciate the whole process of science from making discoveries to publishing your discoveries, and the review process from the editor perspective, until you do that, you really don't grasp the entire scientific enterprise. And so for that, I'm grateful to all the authors that submitted their papers to us. It was indeed an honor to do this.
One of the joys of my time as the editor was I knew many of the people. These are people at my own institution. I knew them through their science, but the real joy and learning came from having a chance to speak to them face to face, get their perspective not only on science but on life and what motivated them. In the editorial board meetings themselves, these were kind of a microcosm of what I could imagine is going on in some of their labs and some of their other discussions. The ebb and the flow. I used to just try and sit back and look at the ebb and the flow of the conversation about submissions. And from these observations, you could tell almost with different board members from the countenance or their posture, how this discussion was going to go and what the trajectory of the paper was going to be.
2020 was a pivotal year, and we had to figure out how to carry on with our business. So we actually wrote an editorial with other editors highlighting the things we did differently. So we were able to move from our roundtable meetings, our weekly meetings, to a video format, right, which worked very well. The other key thing is that many members of our editorial group were ID specialists or public health specialists who had other things to do. And I'm glad that other editors in our group, associated, were able to step up and pick up the pieces and help. Because our submission rate increased about 66% during that time, right? And so I did a recent math. From the time we started to when we left in 2022, we handled more than 23,000 manuscripts, out of which maybe 1,600 went into publication, but the work had to be done, right? And so I was glad that, very grateful that our associate editors were able to get the job done. My other favorite memory has to do with Greg Semenza being awarded a Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2019. I don't think it's ever happened for most journals to have a senior member receive such an award. And I remember very well, so the announcement came on, was it October 7th, 2019? And we were kind of cheering during our meeting the following day. So the announcement was on a Monday. We had our weekly meeting on a Tuesday, and we all shared ideas and so on. Greg couldn't show up because he had to deal with the press. But interestingly, the following week, he came for the editorial board meeting. It shows you how dedicated he was to the journal. And we had a little reception for him and went on right to our business of reviewing the papers and so on. And then a few other memories. So our group started the Viewpoint series, which to me is great because it draws us closer to the ASCI members and the public at large. And we also started the JCI Scholar Program. And we weren't able to, unfortunately, because of COVID, mentor too many, but I think we wound up with maybe 12 mentees. So hopefully some of these mentees will turn out to be good editors in the future. So these are some of the memories. Fun times or difficult times in COVID, but I think we managed to navigate the difficulties and came out fine.
Not quite yet. I will probably hold out because, I'd like to see the full 5 years of what we get before I make that judgment. But, I would like to thank the Johns Hopkins board for leaving us such a lovely impact factor when we came on board. Of course, not sustainable, thanks COVID. That's been a very interesting thing to watch what COVID has done to impact factors for some journals, but impact factors are just one measure. And so I think that's just the way the business goes. But yes, I would like to thank Johns Hopkins for doing such a great job.
What I remember about that time was I thought the most exciting papers were Brown and Goldstein's work, which was at its peak in terms of the cholesterol pathway back in those days. Now, most of those papers were not in the JCI, but some were. So in terms of getting excited about reading papers and having strong feelings about the significance of the work, that stood out, but I can't relate that to any one paper that we handled in the JCI.
I'll mention because right now we're in the midst of the Paris Olympics. This one was a real head spinner and not for scientific reasons. The paper was from a group in Paris. It reported some human research. It was really groundbreaking. We loved it. We accepted it. It was on its way to publication when we got a letter also from Paris implying that the work had been fabricated. Well, that was worrisome. So we paused publication. I contacted INSERM and asked them to look into things. And INSERM got back to us with a remarkable story. It turned out that the manuscript was the innocent bystander of a love triangle. And the letter claiming fraud was from the jilted paramour of one of the authors. Inserm said the work was fine to publish, so we did.
My top choice would be the papers by Mike Brown and Joe Goldstein, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1985. So they're long-term ASCI members and they're ardent supporters of the JCI and the ASCI. I particularly remember a 1993 paper they published while I was editor on hypercholesteremia in low density LDL receptor knockout mice and its reversal by adenovirus mediated gene delivery. This followed another 1994 in JCA, the massive xanthomatosis and atherosclerosis induced by cholesterol fatigue in these mice. I noticed that Mike and Joe recently wrote a very nice article in JCA about the importance of JCA and the whole field of lipid metabolism and disease.
My primary appointment now has been for some years in pharmacology. And this was a paper about grapefruit juice and its impact on drug absorption and degradation. And I asked a well-known guy who subsequently spent a major position at the FDA to write a review about this. And I went back and reread it because I remembered what he said. And he was very insightful in saying that, you know, that yes, there's no question that grapefruit can have an effect, especially on certain of the CYP, CYP3A, the metabolic enzyme, but he said, but the amount of grapefruit juice that you'd have to drink, some of the studies you'd have to do 8 ounces 2 or 3 times a day, and in fact that had been used in the paper that was published. So his comment was, I don't think it's really that much of a risk for most patients, but this is very interesting sort of pharmacology, biology, but it's not really, I'm not sure how important it is really clinically. And I thought he wrote an excellent editorial that was very insightful about that. And it still holds today, actually, that whole idea.
You know, I thought about that, nothing. when you sort of go, well, 2002 is when we finished. It is now 2024, just at the border of 2025. Everything's more than 20 years old. All I could say is, you know, each and every issue, we really felt proud of the papers that we published. Although I must say there were some criticism during the time that we were trying to increase kind of the impact of the work that we published. Someone, John Lau reminded me, someone wrote me a letter unsigned saying, we suggest that you change the name of the journal to the pamphlet of clinical investigation. But at the end, you know, it wasn't just me making the decision. The entire board, you know, really felt this is the right thing to do at this time.
I also looked at interesting papers that came out during our tenure. And I think one of the most highly cited, with about 5,000 citations, is a paper from Tony Ferranti and Rudy Leibel. A very interesting paper. It showed the role of macrophages and inflammation in adipose tissue. If you scroll back to 1955 with a paper by Halville, Howie Eder, and Bragdon, which was the most cited paper in the history of JCI, also having to do with lipoproteins and how to separate them. So there's a connection there. And then fast forward 20 years now with the GLP-1 agonists, and I think there's a connection there between the inflammation in the adipose tissue and what Tony and Rudy reported 20 years ago in, I think, probably the most cited paper during our 5-year tenure. So I don't want to be too parochial and focus on Columbia, but that is one that sticks out.
Generally about research, what I remember is that, and I'm not saying this first because it's the most important one, but when I was starting, and even before we started and you and I were meeting, you mentioned to me how rife papers were with scientific fraud, with Dr. Gels, with repeated panels, etc. And I was skeptical, and boy, you were right. I have to say, I was shocked at the number of times people were at best sloppy, at worst deliberately cheating. And I was also surprised at how reluctant institutions were to actually take action on that because it was embarrassing to them. So that was one memory. A second one was that all of us, because we would get papers in a diverse area of fields, and even with 22 people, it was impossible to cover everything. So usually among the editors or the deputy editors, we divided fields. So we would take on things just because someone had to do it. And I remember I took on ophthalmology, and I got to know, at least by email, many of these senior ophthalmological scientists around the country, and that was a lot of fun. I learned a lot, and I learned that you don't really have to be an expert in the science to be a good editor of a paper. It can be helpful, but it was not essential, and that was very revealing to me. Maybe a third memory is that I had come in to my editorship thinking that I was a good writer and a good editor, but boy, did I learn a lot. And I was pretty sure that when we ended, having seen probably 15,000 papers over the course of 5 years, that I now really was a good writer and a good editor. And I truly understood the importance of a cover letter. It's like a book jacket, that is the single most important part of a paper often. And maybe my last memory, and again, these are not a specific scientific paper, was I think there were a lot of good papers that we didn't publish, and some not so good papers that we did, which was in service to trying to keep a group together and group cohesion. If I had been more dictatorial, we probably would have published some different papers and not some others. On the other hand, I depended upon everyone doing this on a voluntary basis, and so some compromises had to be made.
There were so many high quality and important studies, and to say that one bubbled up to the top, I really can't go there. But what I did find, though, was that there were so many that we were unable to publish. Sadly, they were terrific, but they didn't get published. And so the one of the greatest joys that I have was actually starting JCI Insight, because this is where JCI Insight really flourished. It provided a mechanism for these papers that were terrific studies that advanced the scientific process in the field and needed to be in the literature. And we were able to do that then, take those important studies and provide it to the research community for them to digest and judge. And so I think that for me, one of the greatest research memories, if I'll be, is the initiation and the sustainability of JCI Insight.
I couldn't think of anything specifically, but what really was happening at the time, and that I thought, JCI had a pretty large role in, was the use of gene therapy and gene therapy techniques to modify somatic disease. And there were a number of papers that came through that I thought were going to be not just in cardiology, but in, for example, in neuromuscular disease, that I thought were really important and were really kind of opening up the rest of science to these therapies. And in fact, they're things that we used in our laboratory, not so much even as therapeutics, but as ways to modify mechanism or modify disease to understand mechanism. So that was one of the things that I think was key for me. The others that are memorable are those that came back to multiple editorial board meetings, oftentimes with commentary from the authors that were read at the meetings and brought a smile to your face and hopefully weren't too critical of what we were doing.
Yeah, so I mean, not surprisingly, it's going to be COVID related, right? And so at the time the epidemic was really at the peak, I'm talking March, April 2020, thereabout. We had a paper from a group of scientists from China describing, so the first author was Chen. So it's Chen et al. In 2020, basically describing the clinical and immunological features of this new syndrome, of this new syndrome, right? And as you can imagine, it's not typical JCI, because at that point, sure, there was an association with COVID, that was a given. but they couldn't really offer quote unquote mechanistic insights, right? So I remember we had a very heated discussion. We said, well, other journals are publishing this type of work. I don't think we're out to copy anybody, but this particular group had some pieces in place, especially the immunology, which competitors did not have, right? So after a lot of discussion and debate, we decided, so my favorite term, anytime we'd meet, we'd say, guys, let's give them a chance, right? So we decided to give them a chance and say, look, they're describing a new clinical syndrome. It's evolving. This is at the heart of where it started in China, right? And they had some immunology in place. So I wouldn't say we bent the rules, but we were forward-looking enough to say, look, let's give them a chance, let them put it together. And then we had an editorial piece to go with that. So that was one of my favorite papers, actually. It turned out to be one of the defining papers in the field. It's very much referenced. I think they are up to close to 3,000 citations since 2020. That's how important that paper was. And then there were two back-to-back papers that we published on multi-system inflammatory syndrome, because there was some debate whether this was the same as COVID in children or whether there were distinctions and similarities, right? So we published two papers back to back on that. And again, that was very well received by the field, pediatricians as well as generalists alike, and very well cited. I think both of them have citations in the 200 and so on. So to me, these three papers were examples of how adaptable our group was, right? And then there are papers which I loved. Again, I'm biased in relation to, these were mostly review articles or viewpoints and things like that. Reliving the history of the 100th anniversary of insulin's discovery.
It's hard for me to pick one. I just want to point out one of the things we have been doing different is, just to talk about a category of paper, is we started doing research letters. And I'm hopeful that we have finally figured out the sweet spot of the short format for JCI. And that's built on what some other journals were doing in terms of research letters and what we thought, how we thought that could work for us. And we're seeing a really nice stream of these research letters coming in. They're interesting. Maybe all our attention spans are getting a little shorter, and maybe that's why I like them so much, but I enjoy reading the submissions a lot. They're a nice digestible unit of science. Sometimes it's clinically focused, sometimes it's a little more basic translational, but as a category, I think that's a great way of expressing, here's a really cool observation. And that's what we're seeing in the submission category. And so, so far I'm really pleased, and I hope it continues to grow.